In the winter of 1875, 7 years after Timothy Caldwell's mysterious disappearance from the Missouri State Hospital, a series of unexplained deaths began occurring across 3 different counties in Kansas. The victims were all elderly or infirm individuals who had hired the same young caregiver, a polite, intelligent man in his late teens who called himself Thomas Whitfield. What made these deaths particularly disturbing was not just their frequency, but the clinical precision with which they had been carried out, and the fact that Thomas Whitfield always seemed to vanish just days before anyone began asking questions. Dr. Samuel Harding, now 68 years old and officially retired from medical practice, would spend his final years tracking a killer whose methods had evolved far beyond anything he had documented in those leather-bound journals from Sedalia County. The boy who had once tortured farm animals in caves had grown into something far more dangerous, a predator who had learned to turn human compassion into his greatest weapon. Before we continue with the story of what Timothy Caldwell became, if you missed part 1 of Timothy Caldwell's terrifying story, make sure to watch it first to understand the full horror of what we're dealing with. Subscribe to our channel for the complete series and let us know in the comments if you remember where we left off with the boy who disappeared from the asylum. Thomas Whitfield's reputation as a caregiver had spread through the farming communities of eastern Kansas like wildfire, but not for reasons anyone would have expected. The Kansas of 1875 was a state still finding its identity. The recent end of the Civil War had brought waves of settlers westward, including many families carrying the burden of caring for elderly relatives or war-wounded veterans who required constant medical attention. In rural areas where doctors were scarce and expensive, families often relied on traveling caregivers, young men and women who moved from household to household, providing basic medical care and companionship to those who could no longer care for themselves. Thomas Whitfield appeared to be exactly what these families needed. He was 19 years old, well-spoken, and possessed an unusual depth of medical knowledge for someone so young. When asked about his training, he would explain that he had grown up assisting a country doctor in Missouri, learning through observation and practice rather than formal education. His references were impeccable. Letters from grateful families describing his gentle manner, his dedication to his patients, and his remarkable ability to ease the suffering of the dying. What made Thomas particularly valuable was his willingness to take on the most difficult cases. While other caregivers avoided patients with serious illnesses or violent tendencies, Thomas seemed drawn to precisely these situations. He specialized in caring for elderly individuals suffering from dementia, war veterans struggling with what doctors then called soldier's heart, and terminally ill patients whose families could no longer bear to watch their slow decline. Thomas charged reasonable rates for his services, never so little as to seem suspicious, but never so much as to price himself out of the market. He typically stayed with families for 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the patient's condition, and he always seemed to know exactly when his services would no longer be needed. Families appreciated his honesty about prognosis and his gentle way of preparing them for the inevitable. Dr. Benjamin Wheeler, the county physician for Leavenworth County, first encountered Thomas Whitfield in March of 1875, when the young man brought the death certificate for an elderly patient named Martha Henley. Wheeler had been expecting the death. Mrs. Henley had been suffering from consumption for months, but something about the caregiver struck him as unusual. The young man seemed remarkably composed for someone who had just lost a patient. Wheeler would later write in his journal, "Most caregivers, particularly those who had spent weeks attending to someone, showed some emotional response to death." Thomas Whitfield discussed Mrs. Henley's final moments with the clinical detachment of a seasoned physician, describing her symptoms and decline with scientific precision that seemed at odds with his supposed lack of formal training. What Wheeler found most disturbing was Thomas's apparent interest in the details of the death certificate. The young man asked specific questions about how causes of death were determined. what evidence was required to support various diagnoses, and how thoroughly county officials typically investigated deaths of elderly or infirm individuals. I sensed that he was not asking these questions out of casual curiosity, Wheeler noted. There was a purpose behind his inquiries, as if he was gathering information for future use. Despite his unease, Wheeler could find no fault with Thomas's care of Mrs. Henley. The family spoke glowingly of his dedication, describing how he had sat with her through difficult nights, administered her medications precisely as prescribed, and provided comfort during her final hours. The death appeared entirely natural, consistent with the progression of her illness. Thomas moved from household to household with methodical efficiency. His next patient was Samuel Morrison, a 73-year-old farmer who had suffered a stroke and required assistance with basic functions. Morrison's son, Robert, had hired Thomas after receiving a recommendation from the Henley family, who described the young caregiver as a godsend who had made their mother's final weeks as comfortable as possible. Thomas cared for Samuel Morrison for exactly 4 weeks. During that time, neighbors often saw him walking the property in the early morning hours, sometimes carrying what appeared to be medical supplies, sometimes simply standing quietly in the fields as if deep in thought. When asked about these walks, Thomas explained that he found the morning air helpful for maintaining his own health while caring for demanding patients. Samuel Morrison died on a Tuesday morning in April, apparently suffering a second, more severe stroke during the night. Thomas discovered the body when he came to administer the morning medications, and he immediately summoned Dr. Wheeler to confirm the death. Once again, the family praised Thomas's dedication and professionalism, noting that he had warned them the day before that their father seemed to be declining rapidly. Thomas told us that Dad had been showing signs of another stroke. Robert Morrison told Dr. Wheeler. He said we should prepare ourselves, that it could happen any time. When it did happen, Thomas handled everything perfectly. He kept Dad comfortable and made sure he wasn't alone when he passed. Dr. Wheeler's examination revealed no signs of foul play. Samuel Morrison's death was entirely consistent with the natural progression of stroke-related complications. But Wheeler noted that Thomas once again seemed remarkably unaffected by the loss, asking the same types of clinical questions about documentation and investigation procedures. A pattern began to emerge as Thomas continued his work throughout the spring and summer of 1875. His patients invariably died during his period of care, typically after he had been with them for 3 to 5 weeks. The deaths always appeared natural. Always occurred at times when Thomas was elsewhere in the house or on the property, and always followed periods where Thomas had warned the families to expect the worst. What made the pattern particularly difficult to detect was Thomas's careful selection of patients. He only accepted cases involving individuals who were already seriously ill or in declining health. Families were grateful for his willingness to take on difficult situations that other caregivers avoided, and they attributed the deaths to the natural progression of existing conditions rather than any external cause. Moreover, Thomas never stayed in one area long enough for local authorities to notice the frequency of deaths associated with his presence. He moved in a carefully planned circuit through different counties, ensuring that months or even years passed between his visits to any particular region. By the time he returned to an area, memories had faded, and new families were grateful for his services without connecting him to previous deaths. The death that would eventually expose Thomas Whitfield's true nature occurred in August 1875 in the small farming community of Oskaloosa, Kansas. Reverend Jonathan Hartwell, age 67, had been suffering from what his physician described as failing of the heart, a condition that left him weak and often short of breath, but which was not immediately life-threatening. Hartwell's daughter, Elizabeth, had hired Thomas after her father suffered a particularly severe episode that left him bedridden for several days. The Reverend was a prominent figure in the community, well respected for his decades of service to the local Baptist church, and his declining health had become a source of concern for the entire congregation. Thomas's care of Reverend Hartwell followed his usual pattern. He was attentive, knowledgeable, and reassuring to the family about the patient's condition. He established a routine of medications and treatments that seemed to stabilize the Reverend's symptoms, and for the first 2 weeks of his stay, Hartwell actually showed signs of improvement. What made this case different was the Reverend's mental acuity. Unlike Thomas's previous patients, who had often been confused or weakened by their illnesses, Hartwell remained sharp and observant despite his physical limitations. More importantly, the Reverend had spent decades counseling troubled individuals, and he possessed an intuitive ability to read people that few of Thomas's patients had demonstrated. On the morning of August 15, 1875, Reverend Hartwell called his daughter to his bedside for what he described as an urgent conversation. Elizabeth later told investigators that her father seemed agitated in a way she had never seen before, despite the fact that his physical condition had actually been improving over the previous few days. "Father told me that something was wrong with Thomas," Elizabeth would later testify. "He said that Thomas had been asking strange questions about the church, about our family's finances, about whether we kept money in the house. But what disturbed Father most was the way Thomas looked at him when he thought no one was watching." According to Elizabeth, her father described Thomas's gaze as the look of someone studying a specimen, not caring for a patient. The Reverend had noticed that Thomas showed no genuine concern for his comfort or recovery, but instead seemed to be calculating something whenever he thought he was unobserved. Most disturbing of all, Reverend Hartwell claimed that he had awakened several times during the night to find Thomas standing beside his bed, not administering medication or checking his condition, but simply watching him sleep with an expression of cold curiosity. Father said he felt like Thomas was waiting for something, Elizabeth recalled. "Not waiting to help, but waiting for something to happen. He made me promise that I wouldn't leave him alone with Thomas anymore, not even for a few minutes." Elizabeth assured her father that she would stay close, but she was torn between his concerns and her gratitude for the improvement in his condition since Thomas's arrival. The young caregiver had seemed so professional, so dedicated to his father's welfare, that she found it difficult to believe he could harbor any ill intentions. That afternoon, while Elizabeth was preparing lunch in the kitchen, she heard her father call out from his bedroom. The sound was not his usual summons for assistance, but a cry of alarm that sent her running toward his room. She arrived to find Thomas standing over her father's bed, holding a pillow that he claimed to have been adjusting for the Reverend's comfort. Reverend Hartwell was unconscious but breathing, and Thomas explained that the elderly man had suffered some kind of episode, perhaps a small stroke or heart incident, that had caused him to lose consciousness suddenly. Thomas had been trying to make him more comfortable when Elizabeth heard the commotion. Dr. Wheeler was summoned immediately, and his examination revealed that Reverend Hartwell had indeed suffered some kind of cardiac event. However, the Reverend regained consciousness within a few hours, and his condition stabilized quickly. More importantly, he retained clear memories of what had happened in the moments before he lost consciousness. "Someone tried to smother me," Reverend Hartwell told Dr. Wheeler in private when Thomas was out of the room. "I woke up and that young man was pressing a pillow over my face. When I struggled, he pressed harder. I tried to call out, but I couldn't get any air. I thought I was going to die." Dr. Wheeler was faced with an impossible situation. Reverend Hartwell was a respected member of the community whose word could not be easily dismissed. But Thomas Whitfield had an impeccable reputation and no apparent motive for harming his patient. Moreover, attempting to murder someone in broad daylight, in a house where family members were present, seemed like an act of almost impossible recklessness. When confronted with the accusation, Thomas responded with exactly the right mixture of shock, hurt, and professional concern. He explained that he had been adjusting the Reverend's pillows when the man had suffered his cardiac episode, and that he had been trying to provide support when Elizabeth arrived. He suggested that the Reverend's memories of the incident might have been distorted by the lack of oxygen to his brain during the episode. "I understand that Reverend Hartwell is confused about what happened," Thomas told Dr. Wheeler with apparent sincerity. "Patients who suffer cardiac events often experience hallucinations or false memories. I've seen it many times in my work. The important thing is that he's recovering, and I want to do everything possible to support that recovery." Thomas's explanation was medically plausible, and his demeanor was entirely convincing. But Dr. Wheeler remembered his previous unease about the young caregiver, and he decided to investigate further before dismissing the Reverend's claims. What Wheeler discovered over the next several days would change everything. Working with county officials from neighboring jurisdictions, he began tracking the pattern of deaths associated with Thomas Whitfield's caregiving services. The picture that emerged was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. In less than 6 months, Thomas had been present at the deaths of 17 patients across 3 counties. While each death had appeared natural when considered individually, the cumulative pattern suggested something far more sinister. Moreover, Wheeler discovered that several families had reported minor thefts following their relatives' deaths. Small amounts of money, jewelry, or other valuables that had gone missing, but were attributed to confusion during the grieving process. Most damning of all, Wheeler found evidence that Thomas had been using false references to establish his reputation. The grateful families he claimed to have served in Missouri either did not exist or had never heard of anyone matching his description. Thomas Whitfield had built his entire identity on carefully constructed lies, creating a fictional history that allowed him to move freely among vulnerable populations. As Dr. Wheeler's investigation deepened, he began to uncover connections that reached far beyond the recent deaths in Kansas. Working with law enforcement officials from neighboring states, he discovered reports of similar patterns in Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado, always involving a young caregiver whose patients died with unusual frequency and who disappeared before questions could be asked. The breakthrough came when Wheeler contacted Dr. Samuel Harding in Missouri, seeking information about any young men with medical training who might have moved to Kansas in recent years. Harding's response arrived by telegram within hours of Wheeler's inquiry. "Stop investigating immediately. Stop boy from Sedalia. Case, stop extremely dangerous. Stop will arrive Kansas soonest stop." Dr. Harding, now 68 years old and officially retired, had spent the 7 years since Timothy Caldwell's disappearance tracking reports of suspicious deaths across the American Midwest. His private files contained detailed documentation of more than 40 cases that bore the hallmarks of Timothy's methods, but he had been unable to establish definitive connections between the various incidents. The Kansas deaths represented the clearest pattern Harding had seen since Timothy's escape from the Missouri State Hospital. The systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals, the careful planning and execution, and most importantly, the clinical precision of the killings, all matched the behavioral profile that Harding had developed based on his observations of the boy. When Harding arrived in Oskaloosa 3 days later, he brought with him copies of his original journals from the Caldwell case, along with 7 years' worth of investigation notes and correspondence with law enforcement officials across multiple states. His first stop was Reverend Hartwell's bedside, where he conducted a detailed interview about the attempted murder. What Harding learned confirmed his worst fears. Reverend Hartwell's description of Thomas Whitfield's behavior matched exactly the patterns that Harding had observed in Timothy Caldwell as a child. The cold, calculating gaze, the clinical interest in suffering, the complete absence of genuine empathy. All were characteristics that Harding had documented in his original case study. More importantly, Reverend Hartwell provided details about Thomas's physical appearance that sealed the identification. Despite the passage of 7 years, the young man retained the pale blue eyes, blonde hair, and slight build that had characterized Timothy as a child. Most telling of all, Thomas had a small scar on his left hand that Harding remembered Timothy receiving during their struggle at the Caldwell farm. "It's him," Harding told Dr. Wheeler after interviewing the Reverend. "Timothy Caldwell has been hiding in plain sight, using his medical knowledge and manipulative abilities to kill with impunity. But he's made a crucial error in judgment. He's become overconfident, and that overconfidence has exposed him." Harding's assessment was that Timothy had evolved far beyond the impulsive child killer he had been in Missouri. The adult version had developed sophisticated methods for selecting victims, establishing alibis, and avoiding detection. He had learned to use society's assumptions about young caregivers to his advantage, exploiting the trust and gratitude of grieving families. Most disturbing of all, Harding believed that Timothy was no longer killing purely for experimental purposes. The thefts associated with each death suggested that he had developed a practical motivation for his crimes, using murder as a means of supporting himself while pursuing his larger psychological interests. "He's found a way to make killing profitable," Harding explained to Wheeler. "But the money isn't his primary motivation. It's simply a tool that allows him to continue his real work." Timothy has always been fascinated by the process of dying, by the way people respond to the approach of death. Now he's created a system that gives him unlimited access to victims while providing a legitimate cover for his presence. Working together, Harding and Wheeler developed a comprehensive plan for exposing Timothy's crimes and ensuring his capture. They would need to coordinate with law enforcement officials across multiple jurisdictions, since Timothy's activities had crossed state lines. More importantly, they would need to be prepared for the possibility that Timothy might attempt to flee or, worse, escalate his violence when he realized he was being investigated. The investigation took on new urgency when Thomas Whitfield suddenly announced his intention to leave the Hartwell household. He explained to Elizabeth that her father's condition had stabilized to the point where professional care was no longer necessary, and that he had accepted a position with another family in a neighboring county. Dr. Harding recognized this as Timothy's standard escape pattern, the same method he had used to avoid detection across multiple states. Timothy had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when suspicion was beginning to focus on him, and he invariably disappeared just before authorities could act. But this time, Harding was prepared. Working with Sheriff Marcus Thompson of Jefferson County, he had established surveillance around the Hartwell property and coordinated with law enforcement officials in surrounding areas to monitor roads and railway stations. Timothy would not be allowed to simply vanish as he had so many times before. The surveillance revealed the full extent of Timothy's careful planning and preparation. Rather than simply packing his belongings and leaving town, Timothy spent several days making detailed observations of local law enforcement activities. He was seen watching the sheriff's office from various vantage points, timing the movements of deputies, and apparently mapping escape routes through the surrounding countryside. More disturbing still, Timothy made several visits to the local cemetery, where he was observed studying gravestones and making notes in a small journal. Dr. Harding believed that Timothy was cataloging information about recently deceased individuals, possibly preparing false identities or planning future impersonations. "He's not just planning to escape," Harding told Sheriff Thompson. "He's planning his next identity, his next hunting ground." Timothy has learned to think strategically, to plan months or even years ahead. "We're not dealing with an impulsive killer anymore. We're dealing with someone who approaches murder as a career." The breakthrough came when one of Sheriff Thompson's deputies, conducting routine surveillance, observed Timothy meeting with a stranger at the edge of town. The meeting took place near an abandoned grain mill, away from any casual observers, and lasted approximately 20 minutes. The stranger was subsequently identified as Marcus Sullivan, a confidence man with a history of fraud and forgery, who had recently been released from prison in Missouri. Sullivan specialized in creating false identity documents and had apparently been hired by Timothy to establish a new persona for his next area of operations. This discovery provided law enforcement officials with crucial insight into Timothy's methods. Rather than simply moving from place to place under his existing false identity, Timothy had been systematically creating new personas, complete with fabricated histories and forged references. This explained how he had been able to maintain his reputation as a reliable caregiver despite the pattern of deaths associated with his work. Sheriff Thompson's men arrested Sullivan immediately after his meeting with Timothy, and under interrogation, the forger revealed the full scope of Timothy's identity manipulation. Over the past 7 years, Timothy had commissioned at least 6 different sets of false papers, allowing him to operate under multiple names across various states. More importantly, Sullivan revealed that Timothy had been planning something far more ambitious than his usual pattern of individual murders. The young killer had been gathering information about families throughout Kansas and Nebraska, apparently preparing for what Sullivan described as a grand project. Though the forger claimed not to know the specific details of Timothy's plans, he told me he was tired of killing one person at a time, Sullivan testified. Said he wanted to do something that would be remembered, something that would show the world what he was truly capable of. He'd been talking about finding the perfect situation, the perfect family, where he could conduct what he called comprehensive experiments. This revelation sent chills through everyone involved in the investigation. Timothy had apparently been using his years of freedom not just to continue killing, but to develop more sophisticated and ambitious plans. The individual murders had been preparation for something much larger and more devastating. Dr. Harding suspected that Timothy's grand project involved finding a way to kill multiple people while maintaining the appearance of natural deaths. Given Timothy's medical knowledge and his years of experience manipulating grieving families, he might be planning to target an entire household or even a larger community. Timothy has always been driven by intellectual curiosity about death and human behavior, Harding explained to the assembled law enforcement officials. As a child, he killed to satisfy that curiosity on a small scale. As an adult, his appetite has grown. He's no longer satisfied with simple murders. He wants to conduct large-scale experiments in human suffering and death. The urgency of capturing Timothy increased dramatically when Sheriff Thompson received word that Thomas Whitfield had failed to appear at his scheduled departure from the Hartwell household. Elizabeth Hartwell reported that the young caregiver had left the house early that morning, claiming to be running final errands before his departure, but he had not returned by evening as promised. A search of Thomas's room revealed that he had taken most of his belongings, but had left behind several items that provided crucial insight into his activities. Hidden beneath his mattress, investigators found a detailed journal documenting his observations of the families he had served, including their financial resources, family structures, and personal vulnerabilities. The journal entries revealed Timothy's systematic approach to selecting and manipulating victims. Each family was analyzed in clinical detail, with notes about their emotional weaknesses, their financial situations, and their potential value as subjects for Timothy's psychological experiments. Most disturbing of all, the journal contained detailed plans for what Timothy described as the culmination project, a comprehensive study involving the systematic elimination of an entire family over an extended period, designed to test his theories about grief, desperation, and human survival instincts. The discovery of Timothy's journal triggered an immediate manhunt involving law enforcement officials from 3 states. Based on the detailed planning notes found in his room, investigators believed that Timothy was heading toward Nebraska, where he had apparently identified a wealthy farming family as potential targets for his culmination project. Dr. Harding studied Timothy's notes with growing horror, recognizing the evolution of the boy's original experimental mindset into something far more sophisticated and deadly. Timothy had spent years perfecting his ability to manipulate human emotions and exploit family relationships, and he was now planning to use those skills on an unprecedented scale. He's not just planning to kill this family, Harding told the assembled investigators. He's planning to torture them psychologically, to study their responses as he systematically destroys their lives. Timothy has become obsessed with understanding the limits of human endurance, and he sees this family as the perfect laboratory for his experiments. The target family was identified as the Hendersons of Lancaster County, Nebraska, a prosperous farming clan consisting of patriarch William Henderson, his wife Margaret, their 3 adult children, and 2 young grandchildren. Timothy's notes indicated that he'd been corresponding with the family for several weeks, presenting himself as an experienced caregiver available to assist with William Henderson's declining health. What made the Henderson family particularly vulnerable was their isolation. Their farm was located several miles from the nearest neighbors, and William Henderson's pride had prevented him from seeking help for his increasing physical limitations until his condition had become desperate. The family was grateful for Thomas Whitfield's offer of assistance and had no reason to suspect that they were inviting a killer into their home. Sheriff Thompson immediately dispatched telegrams to law enforcement officials in Nebraska. But the distances involved and the limitations of 1875 communication technology meant that warnings might not reach Lancaster County in time to prevent Timothy from arriving at the Henderson farm. Dr. Harding made the decision to travel to Nebraska himself, despite his advanced age and the physical demands of the journey. He felt a personal responsibility for stopping Timothy, believing that his failure to prevent the boy's escape from the Missouri hospital had enabled 7 years of murder and suffering. "Timothy Caldwell is my responsibility," Harding told Sheriff Thompson. "I studied him, I documented his behavior, and I failed to contain him when I had the chance. If he succeeds in implementing this plan, the blood of the Henderson family will be on my hands as much as his." The journey to Lancaster County took 3 days by railroad and stagecoach, during which Harding reviewed every detail of Timothy's psychological profile and behavioral patterns. He carried with him copies of all his original journals from the Caldwell case, hoping that his insights into Timothy's childhood psychology might provide clues about how to predict and counter the young man's adult strategies. What worried Harding most was Timothy's demonstrated ability to adapt and evolve his methods. The boy who had once killed impulsively and left obvious evidence had grown into a man who could plan months ahead and manipulate complex social situations to his advantage. Timothy had learned from his mistakes, and he was now operating at a level of sophistication that made him far more dangerous than any criminal Harding had previously encountered. The race to reach the Henderson farm became more urgent when Harding received word that Thomas Whitfield had indeed arrived at the property and had been welcomed by the family as their new caregiver. Timothy was now in position to begin implementing his plan, and every hour of delay increased the likelihood that the Henderson family would suffer the fate that Timothy had designed for them. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror that Timothy Caldwell has become reaches new heights. If this story is making your blood run cold, share this video with someone who can handle the terror. Hit that like button to help us bring you more dark historical mysteries, and don't forget to subscribe. Timothy's story is far from over. Let's discover together whether Dr. Harding can finally stop the monster he once studied. Dr. Harding arrived at the Henderson farm on a gray October morning, accompanied by Sheriff Robert Kane of Lancaster County and 2 armed deputies. The property appeared peaceful from a distance, smoke rising from the chimney, livestock grazing in the fields, no obvious signs of distress or violence. But Harding's trained eye immediately noticed subtle details that suggested something was wrong. The family's dogs, which should have barked at the approach of strangers, were nowhere to be seen. The usual morning activities of a working farm, feeding animals, collecting eggs, preparing for the day's work, were absent despite the early hour. Most telling of all, Harding observed that the curtains in several windows had been drawn shut, despite the fact that farm families typically maximized natural light during daylight hours. The closed curtains suggested either that someone was trying to prevent outsiders from seeing into the house, or that the family was no longer able to maintain their normal routines. Sheriff Kane approached the farmhouse with his weapon drawn, while his deputies positioned themselves to cover potential escape routes. Dr. Harding remained with the horses, but close enough to observe and advise based on his knowledge of Timothy's behavioral patterns. The first sign of immediate danger came when Sheriff Kane knocked on the front door and received no response, despite clear evidence that people were inside the house. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney, and the investigators could hear the faint sound of movement from within, but no one came to the door or acknowledged their presence. When Kane tried the door handle, he found it unlocked. Unusual for a farm family who would typically secure their home, especially with a stranger staying on the property. The unlocked door suggested either that the family was no longer able to take basic security precautions or that Timothy wanted to facilitate easy access for reasons of his own. Kane entered the house with extreme caution, calling out to announce his presence and authority. The response he received chilled everyone present. A weak voice from somewhere deep in the house called for help, followed immediately by the sound of a door slamming and footsteps running toward the back of the building. The scene that greeted Sheriff Kane in the main room of the farmhouse was one of carefully orchestrated horror. William Henderson was tied to a chair near the fireplace, conscious but obviously weakened by what appeared to be days of abuse. His wife Margaret lay on a nearby sofa, breathing but unresponsive, apparently drugged into unconsciousness. Most disturbing of all, the room had been arranged like a macabre laboratory. Tables and chairs had been repositioned to create clear sight lines between different areas. Notebooks and medical instruments were laid out with scientific precision, and the walls were covered with detailed charts tracking what appeared to be the family members' physical and emotional responses to various forms of stress and suffering. Timothy had been conducting the comprehensive experiment described in his journal, using the Henderson family as subjects in an extended study of human endurance and psychological breakdown. Based on the evidence in the room, the experiment had been underway for at least a week, during which Timothy had systematically tortured and manipulated each family member while documenting their responses. William Henderson, barely able to speak through his physical exhaustion and emotional trauma, managed to convey that Timothy had isolated each family member in different parts of the house, controlling their access to food, water, and contact with each other. The psychological torture had been as methodical as the physical abuse, with Timothy alternating between apparent kindness and calculated cruelty to maximize confusion and despair. "He told us it was for science," Henderson whispered to Sheriff Kane. "Said he was studying how families break down under pressure, how people choose between saving themselves and saving others. He made us watch. Made us choose." Before Henderson could provide more details, the sound of gunshots erupted from the back of the house, followed by shouting from the deputies who had been covering the rear exits. Timothy had apparently attempted to flee through a back window and had been confronted by law enforcement officers. Dr. Harding rushed toward the sound of the commotion, arriving just in time to see Timothy Caldwell, now a tall, lean young man of 19, standing in the farmyard with his hands raised in apparent surrender. But Harding recognized the pose as another of Timothy's calculated deceptions, designed to create a moment of reduced vigilance that he could exploit. "Don't trust him," Harding shouted to the deputies. "He's planning something." Timothy's response was to smile, the same cold, genuine expression of satisfaction that Harding remembered from their confrontations 8 years earlier. Despite the passage of time and the physical changes of adolescence, that smile remained exactly the same. A window into a mind that found genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. "Dr. Samuel Harding," Timothy said, his voice carrying the educated cadence of an adult, but retaining the same clinical detachment that had characterized his speech as a child. "I wondered when you would find me. Actually, I hoped you would find me. There are some questions I've been wanting to ask you." The conversation that followed would haunt Dr. Harding for the rest of his life. Timothy spoke about his years of freedom as if describing a research project, explaining how he had used his time to refine his understanding of human psychology and perfect his methods of manipulation and murder. "You were right about me, you know," Timothy said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than multiple homicides. "I was never going to become normal, never going to develop empathy or conscience. But you were wrong about one thing. You thought I was broken, defective. I'm not broken, Dr. Harding. I'm evolved. I'm what humans become when you remove the weaknesses that hold most people back." Timothy went on to describe his career as a caregiver in terms that made clear he viewed his victims not as human beings, but as research subjects. He had spent 7 years conducting what he considered the most comprehensive study of human death and suffering ever undertaken, accumulating knowledge that he believed would revolutionize understanding of human psychology. "The Henderson family has been my masterpiece," Timothy continued, his eyes gleaming with the same intellectual excitement that Dr. Harding remembered from their sessions in the Missouri hospital. "I've been able to study an entire family unit under controlled conditions, documenting how fear and pain affect family relationships, how people choose between self-preservation and protecting loved ones." Dr. Harding realized that Timothy was not surrendering, he was gloating. The young man had no intention of being captured alive, but he wanted to share his discoveries with the one person who might appreciate their scientific significance. Timothy viewed their reunion as an opportunity to present the results of his research to his original study partner. "I have journals, Dr. Harding," Timothy said. "Detailed documentation of 43 deaths with comprehensive analysis of victim psychology, family dynamics, and community responses. It's the most complete study of human mortality ever compiled. Aren't you curious to see what I've learned?" The temptation was real. Despite his horror at Timothy's crimes, Dr. Harding's scientific training made him genuinely curious about the insights that might be contained in those journals. Timothy had spent years conducting experiments that no ethical researcher could ever attempt, observing human behavior under conditions of extreme stress that would be impossible to replicate in legitimate studies. But Harding also recognized Timothy's offer as another manipulation, an attempt to exploit his intellectual curiosity in order to gain some advantage or extract some concession. Timothy had always been skilled at identifying and exploiting human weaknesses, and he understood that Harding's commitment to scientific knowledge represented a potential vulnerability. "Where are the other family members?" Dr. Harding asked, refusing to be drawn into Timothy's psychological games. Timothy's smile widened. "That's part of the experiment, Dr. Harding. They're safe for now, but their continued safety depends on the choices that get made in the next few minutes. I've created a situation where you have to choose between capturing me and saving them. Which is more important to you, justice or mercy?" The standoff that followed revealed the full extent of Timothy's planning and preparation. He had not simply been hiding at the Henderson farm. He had been using the property as a base for an elaborate trap designed to capture Dr. Harding and anyone else who might threaten his freedom. Throughout the farmhouse and surrounding buildings, Timothy had positioned the missing family members, the Henderson children and grandchildren, in carefully prepared scenarios that would require immediate rescue if they were to survive. Each family member was in a different location, facing a different type of mortal peril that would worsen over time if not addressed immediately. The eldest Henderson son, James, was trapped in the barn's hayloft, which Timothy had rigged to collapse if disturbed improperly. The daughter Mary was locked in the root cellar with a slow gas leak from a damaged lantern. The two young grandchildren were in the well house, where Timothy had damaged the structural supports and flooding mechanisms to create a gradually deteriorating situation. "You see the beauty of the design," Timothy explained to Dr. Harding with obvious pride. "Each rescue attempt creates time pressure that prevents focus on the others, and attempting to capture me means abandoning all of them to their fates. It's a perfect test of human decision-making under pressure." Sheriff Kane immediately dispatched his deputies to begin rescue operations, but Timothy had calculated correctly. Each situation required careful attention and specialized knowledge to resolve safely. Rushing any of the rescues would likely result in additional casualties, but delaying meant allowing the conditions to worsen. Dr. Harding found himself facing the same type of impossible choice that Timothy had been forcing on his victims for years. As a physician, his instinct was to prioritize saving lives. As a citizen, he knew that allowing Timothy to escape would mean condemning future victims to suffer the same fate as the Henderson family. "This is your final experiment, isn't it?" Dr. Harding asked. "You're not trying to escape. You're trying to prove a point about human nature." Timothy nodded appreciatively. "I knew you would understand eventually. Yes, this is my culminating study. I want to document how society responds when forced to choose between justice and mercy, between punishment and prevention of immediate suffering. The Henderson family has been excellent subjects, but you, Dr. Harding, are the real prize. What happens after your experiment is complete? That depends on the results, Timothy replied. If I'm satisfied with the data I collect today, I might be ready to move on to the next phase of my research. I've been considering branching out from individual and family studies to larger social experiments. Imagine what we could learn from studying an entire community under controlled stress conditions. The implications of Timothy's statement were terrifying. He had apparently been planning to escalate from murdering individuals and families to orchestrating mass casualties, using entire towns or regions as laboratories for his psychological experiments. But Dr. Harding also detected something in Timothy's demeanor that gave him hope. Despite his apparent confidence and careful planning, Timothy seemed to be seeking validation for his work in a way that suggested uncertainty about his next steps. The young man who had once been supremely self-assured was now looking for approval from the authority figure who had originally studied him. "Your research has been impressive," Dr. Harding said carefully, "but it's incomplete. You've studied death and suffering, but you've never studied redemption or recovery. You don't understand the full spectrum of human experience." Timothy's expression shifted slightly, showing the first crack in his controlled facade. "Redemption is an illusion created by weak minds to avoid confronting harsh realities," he said. But there was a note of defensiveness in his voice that hadn't been present before. "Is it? You've spent 7 years running from the consequences of your actions. If you were truly as evolved as you claim, wouldn't you be able to face those consequences directly?" Dr. Harding was taking an enormous risk by challenging Timothy's self-perception, but he sensed that the young man's need for intellectual validation might be stronger than his commitment to escape. Timothy had always craved recognition for his intelligence and insights, and that craving might provide the leverage needed to resolve the situation. The psychological duel that followed lasted nearly an hour, during which Sheriff Kane's deputies worked frantically to rescue the endangered family members. Dr. Harding used every technique he had learned from studying Timothy's psychology to keep the young man engaged in conversation while rescue operations continued. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged of what Timothy had become during his years of freedom. He had indeed evolved far beyond the impulsive child killer he had been in Missouri, but that evolution had come at a cost. The systematic suppression of normal human emotions had left him increasingly isolated and desperate for connection, even if that connection could only come through the terror he inflicted on others. "You're lonely," Dr. Harding realized. "All these years of studying other people, but never allowing yourself to actually connect with anyone. You've made yourself into a perfect predator, but perfect predators are also perfectly alone." Timothy's composure finally cracked completely. "You think I wanted this?" he demanded, his voice rising for the first time since the confrontation began. "You think I chose to be what I am? I've tried to feel what other people feel, tried to understand why they care about things that seem completely meaningless to me, but I can't. There's something missing in me, something that was never there to begin with." For the first time since his childhood, Timothy showed genuine emotion, not the calculated displays he used to manipulate victims, but real anguish about his fundamental inability to experience normal human connections. The brilliant, controlled killer revealed himself to be, at his core, a profoundly damaged person who had turned his damage into a weapon against the world. The rescue operations concluded successfully, just as Timothy's emotional breakdown reached its peak. Sheriff Kane's deputies managed to save all the endangered family members, though several required immediate medical attention for injuries and trauma sustained during their captivity. Timothy's reaction to the successful rescues was telling. Rather than anger or frustration at the failure of his plan, he seemed almost relieved that his victims had survived. The revelation suggested that despite his claims about studying human suffering, some part of him retained enough conscience to prefer that his subjects survive their ordeal. "I'm glad they're safe," Timothy admitted to Dr. Harding. "I didn't really want them to die. I just wanted to finally understand what makes people care about each other the way they do." The capture of Timothy Caldwell made headlines across the Midwest. But the legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the same issues that had plagued his case as a child. The systematic nature of his crimes was undeniable, but his youth at the time of many of the murders, combined with questions about his mental competency, created precedent-setting challenges for prosecutors. Dr. Harding testified extensively about Timothy's psychological development, providing detailed documentation of the young man's evolution from disturbed child to sophisticated killer. His testimony helped establish some of the first legal frameworks for understanding and prosecuting cases involving antisocial personality disorder. Timothy himself proved to be a cooperative defendant, apparently viewing the trial as another opportunity to share his research findings with a wider audience. He testified about his methods and motivations with the same clinical detachment he had always shown, providing insights into criminal psychology that would influence law enforcement and medical professionals for decades. The verdict was life imprisonment without possibility of parole, with the stipulation that Timothy would be held in a specially designed facility that could accommodate both his dangerous nature and his value as a subject for legitimate psychological research. Dr. Harding visited Timothy regularly during the first year of his imprisonment, conducting formal interviews that were published as part of groundbreaking research into the nature of psychopathy. These sessions revealed that Timothy's capacity for manipulation and violence remained undiminished, but that his desperate need for intellectual connection made him a valuable source of information about criminal psychology. He represents something that medical science is only beginning to understand, Dr. Harding wrote in his final report on the case. Timothy Caldwell is not evil in the supernatural sense. He is the product of a specific type of neurological development that creates intelligence without empathy, curiosity without conscience. Understanding individuals like Timothy may be the key to preventing future tragedies. The Henderson family eventually recovered from their ordeal, though the psychological scars remained for years afterward. William Henderson became an advocate for better screening of domestic caregivers, working with law enforcement agencies to develop protocols for preventing similar deceptions in the future. The detailed journals that Timothy had maintained throughout his criminal career became invaluable resources for researchers studying serial murder and psychological manipulation. His meticulous documentation of victim psychology and family dynamics provided insights that helped law enforcement officials solve several cold cases and identify patterns in other unsolved crimes. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Timothy's capture was the advancement in understanding of childhood psychological development that resulted from Dr. Harding's research. The case established new protocols for identifying and treating children who showed early signs of antisocial behavior, potentially preventing others from following Timothy's path. Timothy himself adapted to prison life with characteristic intelligence and calculation. He became a model prisoner, using his understanding of human psychology to manipulate guards and administrators while maintaining the appearance of cooperation and rehabilitation. Dr. Harding's final visit to Timothy took place in 1876, shortly before the elderly physician's death. During that conversation, Timothy revealed that he had been using his time in prison to develop new theories about human behavior, based on his observations of the criminal population around him. "I've learned so much here, Dr. Harding," Timothy said during their last meeting. "Prison is like a laboratory where all the subjects have already been classified according to their psychological defects. I'm developing a comprehensive understanding of criminal motivation that goes far beyond anything I learned from killing individual victims." When asked whether he felt any remorse for his crimes, Timothy's answer revealed that his fundamental nature remained unchanged despite years of incarceration. "I understand intellectually that what I did caused suffering, and I understand that society considers that suffering to be wrong," he said. "But I still don't feel what other people apparently feel when they contemplate harm to others. I can simulate remorse convincingly enough to satisfy parole boards or psychiatrists, but the genuine emotion simply isn't there." Timothy's honesty about his continued dangerousness ensured that he would never be released from prison, but it also provided valuable insights for researchers working to understand and treat similar cases. His willingness to discuss his psychological makeup openly made him one of the most studied criminals in American history. The case files from Timothy Caldwell's crimes were sealed for 50 years after his conviction, but when they were finally opened to researchers in the 1920s, they provided foundational material for the emerging field of criminal psychology. Timothy's detailed documentation of his own thought processes and methods became required reading for FBI profilers and forensic psychiatrists. Dr. Harding died in 1877, 1 year after Timothy's conviction, having finally achieved his goal of stopping the killer he had first encountered as a disturbed child in rural Missouri. His final journal entry, written just days before his death, reflected on the broader implications of the Timothy Caldwell case. I have spent the last decade of my life tracking a single individual, documenting his evolution from troubled child to sophisticated killer. That pursuit has taught me more about the nature of evil than 40 years of conventional medical practice. Timothy Caldwell represents both a unique aberration and a window into the darkest possibilities of human development. Understanding him has been the most important work of my career, but I pray that future generations will never encounter another individual quite like him. Timothy Caldwell remained in prison until his death in 1923 at the age of 67. During his 47 years of incarceration, he continued to serve as a subject for psychological research while developing increasingly sophisticated theories about human behavior and criminal motivation. His death marked the end of one of the most extensively documented cases in the history of American criminal psychology. But the questions raised by his case about the nature of evil, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the factors that create individuals capable of such systematic cruelty continue to challenge researchers and philosophers to this day. The Timothy Caldwell case established precedents for understanding and prosecuting similar crimes, but it also served as a sobering reminder of the limits of human knowledge. Despite decades of study and documentation, fundamental questions about Timothy's psychology remained unanswered at the time of his death. In his final interview, conducted just months before he died, Timothy was asked whether he had any regrets about the path his life had taken. His answer provided a chilling glimpse into a mind that remained alien to normal human experience even after nearly 5 decades of imprisonment. I regret that I didn't have access to better research facilities and more sophisticated experimental subjects. The work I was able to accomplish was limited by the primitive conditions and small sample sizes available to me. If I had been born in a later era with access to modern technology and larger populations, I believe I could have made genuine contributions to the understanding of human psychology. Even facing death, Timothy Caldwell viewed his life of murder and torture primarily in terms of missed scientific opportunities. The complete absence of genuine remorse or human connection remained his defining characteristic until the end. This case reminds us that evil can take forms that challenge our most basic assumptions about human nature and moral development. Timothy Caldwell's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the origins of conscience, the possibility of redemption, and the responsibility of society to protect itself from individuals who exist outside the normal boundaries of human empathy. What do you think drove Timothy Caldwell to become such a methodical killer? Was he born without the capacity for empathy, or did his early trauma create the monster he became? And most disturbing of all, could there be others like him, hiding in plain sight among us today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales from America's dark past. The story of Timothy Caldwell may be over, but the questions it raises about human nature continue to haunt us more than a century later. Will there be others like him? Only time will tell.